Cash Johnny Cane's The Minutiae, starring Vaughn Coovey. Episode 1, Mayor of Ten Sleep, Wyoming.
Vaughn Coovey, Mayor of Ten Sleep, Wyoming. Vaughn Coovey's life used to be measured in downs, quarters, and yard lines. As head football coach at Worland High School, his work had been one long chain of film sessions, play scripts, and practice schedules, each week distilled into a game plan and a scoreboard. He had learned early that winning wasn't about inspiration. It was about preparation, every assignment clear, every role rehearsed long before the whistle blew. Those habits followed him back to Ten Sleep, Wyoming. First on to the town council, then into the mayor's office, he found the rhythm had changed, but the work was familiar. Instead of linebackers and nose tackles, he had budget sheets and ordnance drafts. Instead of scouting rival teams, he was studying river levels, road conditions, and state statutes. The job, if done properly, still came down to the same question. Would the system hold when pressure hit? Wildfire season in the Bighorn foothills of Wyoming had never been something Ten Sleep could ignore, but this year felt different. Dry winds poured down from the timber near the James T. Sabin lookout, turning the canyons and brush outside town into a fuse. One lightning strike could have sent a fire charging toward ranches and the highway within minutes. In the mayor's office above Main Street, Vaughn kept the National Weather Service open in a permanent browser tab. On red flag days, the warning banner glowed across the top of his screen. He checked the polygon map, zoomed in until the contour lines of the Bighorn foothills appeared, and confirmed that Ten Sleep sat squarely inside the hazard area. He copied the start and end time of the warning onto a legal pad and underlined the words gusty southwest winds and single-digit humidity. A second spreadsheet on his computer tracked conditions the way he had once charted rushing yards and completions. One tab was nothing more than dated entries. Creek levels noted after dawn drives along Ten Sleep Creek, casual observations on how far the water had pulled back from the banks, and comments on how the pasture grass looked under his boots, spring soft, mid-season stiff, or late summer brittle. Another column logged wind patterns and last measurable rain pieced together from the town's small weather station and from remarks passed along by ranchers at the co-op. Notices came in from utilities as well. An email from Paint Rock Energy and Light Company in Worland flagged upcoming line maintenance in the canyon and reminded the town that certain segments would be de-energized on a rotating schedule. Vaughn printed it and added it to a growing stack of fire season documents in his tray. He opened a manila folder from the bottom drawer, marked in his own handwriting, Wildland Last Year. Inside was the previous preseason readiness checklist the town had half completed. Section headings looked impressive: equipment, staffing, training, community mitigation, but page after page showed unfinished tasks, question marks, and notes about things to be done after busy season. A circled number showed last year's volunteer count, crossed out and replaced with a lower figure as people moved away, aged out, or stopped responding to texts. He set the folder beside a new legal pad where he had drawn 3 thick headings: fuel, water, people. Under each, he had listed specific gaps: uncut brush along access roads, unverified drafting points on the creek, and unknown availability of volunteers during weekday afternoons. The comparison between the vague, half-checked form in the folder and the sharper, segmented plan on the pad made the difference between seasons visible. Standing at the window, looking out toward the canyon and the dark line of timber beyond, Vaughn understood that whatever had passed for good enough last year would not survive this one. The conditions were too dry, the winds too strong, and the town too exposed. The coach in him recognized the pattern. Ten Sleep was a team that had escaped with one too many narrow wins, mistaking luck for strategy. This year could not be business as usual. It had to be a full reset. The more Vaughn dug into the files, the worse the picture became. On paper, Ten Sleep had a fire cache, a volunteer department, and a mutual aid relationship with the county. In reality, the system looked like a storage room that time had quietly hollowed out. He started with the equipment inventory. The firehouse had a typed list: one brush truck, one older structural engine, a trailer of hand tools, radios, SCBA packs, spare hose lengths, and miscellaneous fittings. Vaughn walked the apparatus bay with Fire Chief Titus Hauber's assistant, Colum Eckhart, clipboard in hand, and checked each line against what was actually on the floor or shelves. Items listed as serviceable turned out to have cracked gaskets, dry-rotted hose jackets, or uncertain maintenance histories. Radios had dead batteries and missing charging docks. Ladders passed a visual test but showed out-of-date inspection stickers. In the gear room, turnout coats and wildland jackets hung in neat rows, disguising their age. Tags revealed manufacture dates more than a decade old. Some helmets belonged to volunteers who no longer lived in town. Boots were mismatched, and gloves were stiff from past seasons and improper storage. The basic questions, how many complete sets of protective gear could they reliably field in an incident, did not yield a confident answer. The volunteer roster told a quieter but more troubling story. A printed list taped to the whiteboard at the station showed names in black marker. Next to several, someone had added notes: on oil field rotation, moved to Sheridan, no phone reception at new place. Cross-checking that list against recent call logs, Vaughn realized that the number of people actually available and reliably responding had dropped to a fraction of what the town still believed it had, and that the current de facto leader among the volunteers, Claire Powderly, was carrying more of the burden than any one person should. He returned to his office with a binder of reports and a sense of structural frailty. He penciled 3 simple metrics onto his legal pad. How many people could staff both trucks at once? How many? Consecutive days could they sustain operations if a fire ran for a week? How many working radios could be deployed before they ran out of spares? None of the answers satisfied him. The conclusion, reached not by instinct, but through slow, methodical comparison of lists to reality, was blunt. The town of 10 Sleep was not ready. The fire cache was outdated, the gear was worn out, and the volunteer crew was smaller than it had been in decades. If a blaze started and grew beyond the first few minutes, the town's contribution to its own survival would be limited and largely ineffectual. He wrote a single line at the bottom of the page: objective, bring every controllable variable as close to ready as possible. Then under that, in smaller letters, no more surviving on luck. Vaughn's first formal move was to ask Town Clerk Gannon Colby to draft a notice for an emergency work session and to post it at Town Hall, the post office, and on the town's website. The agenda was straightforward, with a single broad heading, Wildland Fire Readiness, broken down into specific sub-items: equipment condition, volunteer capacity, mutual aid framework, funding options, and public communication plan. When the appointed evening arrived, the meeting room behind Town Hall filled with the familiar mix of council and regulars. Council members took their seats along the dais, paper packets and highlighters in front of them. Town Administrator Livia Marquette sat beside Vaughn, with Fire Chief Titus Hauber and Volunteer Captain Claire Powderly at the front table. In the back row, Maud Estenaz and Gladdy Kane, who rarely missed a meeting of any kind, settled into their usual spots. On the wall, a whiteboard carried a hand-drawn map of 10 Sleep and its surroundings: the canyon road, ranch lanes, creek crossings, and the timber line to the north. Vaughn opened the session by framing the purpose as fact-finding rather than blame. Gannon Colby read the agenda into the record, then he moved them quickly into the first item, equipment. Chief Hauber produced the inventory lists, and together they went line by line. As each piece was mentioned, notes were taken. Engine 1, pump test overdue, brush truck, pass, portable pump, out of service awaiting repair. SCBA bottles, several past hydrotest date, wildland packs, incomplete sets. Gannon used a 3-column format on the whiteboard: serviceable, marginal, failing, and assigned each item based on the chief's assessment. Rourke Zabrinsky kept a running tally in his notebook, circling the failing entries. Finola Hartridge asked quietly for replacement cost estimates, her mind already counting dollars. Alma Frostley scribbled notes about potential impacts on tourism if a major fire hit in peak season, while Bryn Asterly, with her ranching background, underlined every item that would affect initial attack on outlying properties. Next came staffing. Chief Hauber provided a roster and recent response statistics. The council compared the theoretical volunteer list with the number of people who had responded to the last 3 major calls. The difference was stark. Numbers were written in the margins. Roster, X, active, Y, daytime available, Z. It became clear that while the town liked to say, "We have a volunteer department," what it truly had was a shrinking core group carrying an increasing load. Vaughn asked Livia Marquette to note specific action items, verify the status of pagers and radios for each active member, update the roster to remove inactive names, and identify minimum staffing thresholds for both engines and any mutual aid responses. Only when the council had a shared, documented picture of the problem did Vaughn move to the next procedural step, expanding the circle. He requested that Livia and Gannon schedule a joint session with county partners, specifically Bridgetta Pipkin, the County Emergency Management Coordinator, Hank Pograbinski, the County EMS Director, Laird Marvin, the County Fire Warden, and Dexter Bray, the County Sheriff. He wanted the town's deficiencies laid out not as an embarrassment, but as a case for why county support and coordination would be essential. The work session ended not with applause, but with a list of tasks assigned and deadlines written clearly beside them. For Vaughn, that was the only acceptable outcome. Recognizing that 10 Sleep could not fix its vulnerabilities in isolation, Vaughn turned to federal expertise. He began by having Gannon Colby assemble a packet for outside agencies, basic town demographics, maps of the surrounding foothills, the updated equipment status chart, and a brief description of recent fire weather patterns. With that packet in hand, he drove to the Bureau of Land Management's field office in Worland. The building was unremarkable from the outside, just another low federal structure. But inside, the conference room held the tools he needed: large-scale maps, GIS displays, and people whose daily work involved fire behavior across landscapes far larger than 10 Sleep's town limits. He sat down with Fire Management Officer Juniper Vale and her assistant, Rhett Hollis. Instead of a plea, he presented information: where the town's protection district began and ended, which roads served as primary and secondary access routes, and where past fire perimeters had run up against private land. He laid out the town's internal assessment, the degraded equipment, the limited volunteers, the exposure of ranches and highway traffic, so they could see how local weakness intersected with federal responsibility. Juniper pulled up layered maps on a monitor, adding fuel models, slope gradients, and historical ignition points. Together, they identified ridge lines where a lightning strike would quickly turn into a canyon-running blaze, benches where cured grass could carry fire laterally, and pockets of heavy, downed timber that would act as heat reservoirs. Rhett annotated these on-screen and marked potential control features: roads, ridges, and drainages. They agreed on a formal readiness review. The BLM would map areas of highest fuel concentration adjacent to the town and key infrastructure, assess the condition and reliability of primary and alternate access routes, including potential bottlenecks and single points of failure, inventory and mark on maps all reliable water sources, natural ponds, stock tanks, creek drafting locations, and hydrants, and produce written recommendations for priority fuel reduction, signage, and pre-planned control lines. Deadlines were set: field visits within a defined 2-week window, preliminary findings in writing by a specified date, and a follow-up meeting to integrate those findings into 10 Sleep's own plan. By the time Vaughn left the Worland office, the problem no longer existed solely as a knot in his stomach and a jumble of local impressions. It had become a shared, mapped reality, with outside professionals committed to quantifying what his instincts already told him. 10 Sleep sat in a vulnerable position that needed deliberate design, not hope. From Worland, Vaughn took the longer drive to Cheyenne and the Wyoming State Forestry Division. Where BLM brought landscape and fuel modeling, the state brought training pipelines and grant familiarity, exactly the levers he needed to move a small town from barely hanging on to competently prepared. At the forestry offices, he met with State Fire Management Officer Shepard Langley. They reviewed 10 Sleep's current volunteer roster, call history, and the list of courses the department had sporadically completed over the years. Shepard pointed out where volunteers were lacking foundational wildland courses, where refreshers had lapsed, and how that would limit their integration into larger, multi-jurisdictional incidents. Together, they built a training sequence. Introductory wildland classes offered regionally, an annual refresher before peak season, and opportunities for a few key volunteers to obtain advanced qualifications that would allow them to serve as squad leaders or engine bosses. They discussed scheduling, how to cluster sessions so that volunteers who worked full-time jobs could realistically attend, and how to coordinate with neighboring departments to share instructors and costs. Next came the funding side. Shepard brought in Paul Schenectady, a state forestry grants specialist, who walked Vaughn through the major programs, FEMA's Assistance to Firefighters grant for big-ticket items like engines and SCBA, and the State Forestry Rural Fire Capacity Program for smaller but essential gear like hoses, tools, and wildland PPE. Paul explained scoring criteria, common pitfalls in applications, and how to align 10 Sleep's requests with state and national priorities, emphasizing risk reduction, regional benefit, and interoperability. Forestry staff offered to review 10 Sleep's draft applications before submission, providing template language for certain sections and examples of successful past proposals from similar-sized departments. Vaughn took notes on required data, past incident logs, current taxable valuation, budget breakdowns, and letters of support from county officials such as Bridgetta Pipkin, Laird Marvin, and Dexter Bray. By the time he turned back toward 10 Sleep, he carried more than good intentions. He had a sequence, a training plan with dates and course codes, a grant calendar with submission deadlines circled, and a clear list of documents the town needed to assemble. The path from "we need better gear" to "we have a fundable project" was becoming much less abstract. Back home, Vaughn knew that no amount of planning or outside support would matter if he couldn't assemble reliable manpower. 10 Sleep's volunteers were the hinge on which every other effort would swing. He began with a targeted recruitment drive. Flyers went up at the co-op, the cafe, the gas station, and the school. Simple, direct notices explaining what roles were needed, how training would be provided, and what kind of call-out patterns to expect during fire season. Principal Tessa Doubleday at the local school agreed to let him speak briefly at a staff meeting and to send a notice home with older students' families, highlighting opportunities for younger adults to serve in support roles. The town's website and social media channels echoed the same message, paired with clear contact details and a scheduled information night at the community hall. Lucas Nibbitz, who handled much of the community hall and church event logistics, helped set up chairs, coffee urns, and sign-in sheets. At that meeting, Vaughn laid out the commitments in practical terms: expected training hours, average annual call volume, and physical demands for line work versus support roles. Sign-up sheets were organized by category: line firefighter, water tender driver, logistics support, communications, so people uncomfortable with direct fire line work could still see where they fit. Claire Powderly, as volunteer captain, stood at the back table helping potential recruits find roles that matched their abilities. Parallel to recruitment, Vaughn met with local business owners in a scheduled roundtable. Ron Delafosse, chair of the local business association, helped gather employers from Main Street and the outskirts. With Livia Marquette at his side, Vaughn proposed simple agreements. During the designated fire season, employees who served as volunteers could be released for call-outs up to a set number of hours per month without penalty. In return, the town would explore ways to recognize participating businesses publicly and seek small stipends or reimbursements for lost productivity through future grants or contingency funds. Those discussions were practical and specific. Employers asked how they would be notified when a call-out was legitimate. Dispatch protocols, managed by Lulu Skirving, the county dispatch supervisor, were explained. They wanted to know how to handle overlapping absences, Vaughn worked with them to define maximum simultaneous releases. Everything agreed upon went into short memoranda of understanding, drafted by Gannon Colby and signed by both the town and the businesses. For ranchers, the conversation took a different form. Vaughn arranged a separate briefing at the community hall, timed to catch them between calving pressures and haying. Whip Dobler, a respected rancher and informal spokesperson, helped spread the word. Vaughn used maps produced by BLM to show potential fire run routes toward their pastures and buildings. From there, he invited their input on access points, water sources, and places where heavy equipment could be staged ahead of time. These sessions did more than recruit a few new volunteers. They created a network of informal partners willing to open gates, offer stock ponds as drafting sites, and accept predetermined dozer lines if fire conditions demanded them. By the end of these interactions, the word volunteer meant more than a dwindling list of names at the station. It became a broader commitment spread across employers, ranchers, and townspeople who understood that readiness was a shared responsibility. With manpower strengthening, Vaughn turned toward the financial backbone, upgrading the hardware that had been limping through recent seasons. He structured the work the way he once built offensive playbooks, clearly assigned tasks, deadlines, and contingencies. For the FEMA assistance to firefighters grant, he worked closely with Chief Hauber and Town Administrator Livia Marquette. Chief Hauber compiled technical specifications, the condition and age of each apparatus, estimated replacement costs, desired features on new engines, and a prioritized list of SCBA packs, radios, and protective gear. Livia handled the narrative sections, weaving in incident statistics, population served, and the disproportionate impact a major fire would have on a town of 10 Sleep's size. They coordinated with Paul Schenectady by phone and email, sending him early drafts for comment. Paul suggested phrasing that emphasized risk to critical infrastructure and the importance of 10 Sleep as a junction on regional travel routes. Letters of support from Brigetta Pipkin, Hank Pograbinski, Laird Marvin, and Dexter Bray were gathered and appended. In parallel, they tackled the State Forestry Rural Fire Capacity Grant. This application focused on smaller items: hoses, hand tools, wildland clothing, gloves, but required careful demonstration of matching funds and assurances that purchases would directly support wildland operations. Vaughn ensured that the town's budget could provide the necessary match, even if it required shifting line items or delaying non-essential projects. As a final layer, he directed Livia to prepare an application for the BLM Rural Fire Readiness Equipment Transfer Program. This was not about acquiring new, top-of-the-line apparatus, but about identifying surplus federal equipment that 10 Sleep could maintain and use effectively. They prepared a candid inventory, what the town could reasonably keep fueled, serviced, and housed, and which types of engines or support units would integrate best with their terrain and crew capabilities. Each grant and application moved forward with checklists, not wishes. The town tracked submission dates, confirmation receipts, and estimated award timelines, understanding that some investments would arrive too late for the current fire season but would pay dividends in the next. Recognizing that funding and equipment would likely take time, Vaughn focused on immediate low-cost mitigation that could reduce risk before the first dry thunderstorm. He organized community brush clearing days, dividing the town and surrounding wildland-urban interface into sectors. Maps were printed and assigned to team leaders, each map marked with property lines, public right-of-ways, and known hazards like steep embankments or old fencing. Volunteers were briefed each morning on safety, tool handling, heat stress awareness, and escape routes. Work crews raked pine needles away from building foundations, cut back ladder fuels along fence lines, and piled slash-in designated areas for later chipping or controlled burning under supervision. Lucas Nibbitz handled many of the logistics, unlocking the hall, arranging coffee and water stations, and seeing that tools were checked in and out. In coordination with ranchers, Vaughn encouraged targeted grazing along certain access roads and around critical infrastructure, like power line corridors and water tanks. Whip Doubler helped translate these plans into practical pasture management decisions, balancing fuel reduction with forage needs later in the season. Simultaneously, Vaughn pushed forward with the installation of 6 strategically placed water tanks around the foothills. Site selection involved more than just convenience. Each location had to be accessible to engines, far enough from heavy fuel concentrations to remain usable in active fire conditions, and logistically feasible to refill. Landowner agreements were drafted and signed, giving formal permission for tanks and ensuring liability questions were settled in advance. Each installed tank received a unique identifier and GPS coordinates, which were logged into the fire department's pre-plans. Simple, durable signs were posted at the sites and at nearby road intersections using words and numbers that visiting mutual aid crews could read easily under smoke and stress. By the time the last tank was filled and the final slash pile stacked, the landscape around 10 Sleep looked subtly different. Not fireproof by any means, but less eager to burn. Knowing that even the best prepared town might still face a fast-moving fire, Vaughn turned to evacuation and communication systems, the pieces that would determine whether residents had time to act. First, he commissioned a review of all existing evacuation routes. The fire department and county road crew drove each designated path, checking for narrow choke points, overhanging vegetation, and signage gaps. Where needed, branches were trimmed, shoulders were cleared, and new signs were ordered. Vaughn insisted that every sign follow a consistent format with arrows and wording that could be understood at a glance by someone driving through smoke or at night. Next came the reverse 911 alert system, using WENS. Under the guidance of dispatch supervisor Lulu Skirving, the system had not been fully tested in some time, and Vaughn was unwilling to discover weaknesses during an actual emergency. The town prepared a public notice campaign, newsletters, website announcements, flyers at key locations, explaining that a test alert would be sent on a specified evening and that residents should treat it as a drill. On the day of the test, Lulu's team followed a scripted protocol, composing a message that included the 4 essential elements Vaughn had mandated: what was happening, where, what residents needed to do, and where to find more information. After the alert was sent out, the town gathered feedback. Who had received the message, who had not, which phone numbers had bounced, and whether the wording had been clear. The contact database was updated accordingly. Inside the fire station, laminated map sets were produced for every engine and command vehicle. These maps showed roads, water sources, potential safety zones, and predetermined staging areas. Copies were also made for mutual aid units that might respond from outside the region. Vaughn scheduled a tabletop exercise one Saturday morning, bringing together Chief Hauber, Volunteer Captain Powderly, Sheriff Bray, County Emergency Manager Pipkin, and key town staff. The scenario was simple: a lightning strike in the timber near the canyon with winds pushing smoke toward town. Over several hours, they walked through each step: initial page, arrival of first units, size up, radio traffic, resource requests, road closures, evacuation decisions, media inquiries. Every assumption that could be challenged was written in red on an easel pad, then converted into a plan adjustment. By the end of that process, 10 Sleep's readiness existed not just as equipment and goodwill, but as a rehearsed sequence. How to warn people, which roads to close first, which neighborhoods to clear, and how to keep information flowing when tension climbed. When the first real test came, it followed the pattern everyone had feared. A dry afternoon thunderstorm rolled across the Bighorns, trailing little rain but plenty of lightning. One strike landed in the timber above the canyon, and before long a thin column of smoke began to unwind into the sky. The report came into dispatch, and the system moved into motion. Lulu Skirving's team sent automated text alerts out across the volunteer network, following updated call groups to avoid wasted alerts. Active volunteers acknowledged their response by radio or text, confirming who was en route to the station and who could respond directly in personal vehicles to pre-established staging areas. Engines rolled along routes they had already driven in pre-season drills, their operators knowing where the road narrowed, where to watch for wandering stock, and where to safely pass slower vehicles. Mutual aid requests followed the new protocol, hitting Brigetta Pipkin and Laird Marvin in the sequence agreed months before. Hank Pograbinski prepared EMS units for potential smoke inhalation or injury cases, while Dexter Bray's deputies positioned themselves at key intersections for possible closures. On scene, the first-in crew found the fire running through cured grass and brush, pushing toward one of the previously identified control lines. They requested support at specific water tank locations by identifier, not vague descriptions. Within minutes, tenders were drafting from the nearest tanks, refilling engines that would otherwise have had to shuttle from farther away. As the afternoon wore on, the fire tested every part of the plan. A gust front shifted the smoke toward a cluster of homes, triggering the evacuation thresholds they had agreed on during the tabletop exercise. WENS alerts were sent using the prepared script structure. Deputies moved door to door along routes cleared in the evacuation review. Brush-cleared zones around properties slowed the fire enough for crews to anchor and flank the head. By nightfall, the fire was not trivial, but it was boxed. Lines held where they had been sketched on maps months earlier. No homes had burned. No families were displaced. The post-incident debrief would note radios that struggled in certain draws and a few stretches of road still needing better signage, but the overall verdict was clear. This time, 10 Sleep had met the test with more than luck. In the weeks that followed, Vaughn insisted on an after-action review that was as thorough as any pre-season planning meeting. The fire department, county officials, dispatch, and town staff gathered to catalog what had worked and what had not. Notes were taken on the performance of the new water tanks, the accuracy of the BLM fuel maps, and the response of the public to evacuation alerts. From that review came updates to the town's annex in the County Emergency Operations Plan and revisions to the internal checklists that had once sat incomplete in a drawer. Grant applications continued their course through federal and state channels, now strengthened by evidence that 10 Sleep was serious about using any awarded funds to maximum effect. Word of the town's performance traveled. Neighboring communities requested copies of 10 Sleep's evacuation scripts, volunteer MOUS, and mitigation maps. County leaders, already familiar with Vaughn's work from previous budget cycles, saw in his Wildfire effort a template for how a small jurisdiction could leverage planning, partnerships, and disciplined follow-through. When they approached him about stepping into a broader role as a Washakie County Commissioner, it was Josiah Garrick and Prue Paisley who made the call. They framed it not as a reward, but as a continuation of the same work at a larger scale, overseeing roads, emergency services, land use, and the interlocking systems that decided whether the next crisis would be absorbed or amplified. For Vaughn, the decision required only a pause long enough to look out again toward the foothills he had just helped protect. The same instincts that had pulled him from a high school sideline to the mayor's office now nudged him toward the county seat. The field was getting bigger. The game plan needed to follow. He accepted, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that 10 Sleep was stronger than when he'd found it, and that the methods he'd used there, checklists made real, systems rehearsed, people brought into shared ownership, would be the foundation for whatever came next.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Bye-bye.